By the time Victoria Kelly reached the Bath Coaching Arcade, rain had already worked through wool, linen and skin until her thin pelisse clung to her shoulders like a second, colder body. Water ran from the brim of her bonnet in a steady line and gathered at her jaw before falling to the parcels in her arms. One gloved hand held Lady Kelly's round bandbox of silk slippers, wrapped twice in oilcloth that she had been forbidden to stain. The other pressed without thought against the hollow beneath her ribs where hunger had begun to sharpen into pain. Carriages rolled in and out under the stone arch. Wheels hissed on wet cobbles. Horses stamped and tossed their heads, while grooms shouted over the weather. People watched her in the passing way. People watched stray dogs with brief curiosity and no intention of helping. She was 22 years old, dark-haired and pale, with large eyes that looked too alert in a face worn thin by poor sleep and poorer meals, and she stood among lacquered trunks and polished boots, looking as though she had been misplaced from another household entirely. The slipper box was worth more than the dress on her back. The man unloading valises from a Bristol coach offered her a glance that stopped at the frayed edge of her cuff and moved on. No one asked why a gentlewoman's daughter carried baggage in the rain while her elders remained dry. Lady Kelly remained dry by design. She stood beneath the broadest stretch of awning in lavender silk and cream gloves, the scent of rosewater and something sharper cutting through wet wool and horse steam whenever she turned. She had positioned herself where acquaintances entering the arcade could not miss her. Her two daughters stood at either side, bright as enamel in plum and dove grey, skirts lifted delicately clear of puddles. Victoria had been ordered to stand 3 paces behind. She had not managed it. The tide of travellers had pushed her forward, then back, until she hovered at the edge of her stepmother's conversation, like furniture set in the wrong room. Lady Penhurst paused in greeting, smiled with white teeth and asked, "And this young person?" Lady Kelly did not look at Victoria when she answered, "A plain relation. She earns her bread by gratitude." Her tone made gratitude sound like a debt that would never be settled. The daughters laughed softly, as if the remark were too mild to be cruel. Victoria lowered her gaze because she had learned that expression could be counted as insolence. Her gloves were wet through at the fingers. The skin beneath had begun to sting. A droplet slid from her sleeve into the bandbox seam, and panic flashed through her with such force that her throat tightened. If the silk slippers inside were marked, she would lose supper again. Lady Kelly turned at last, eyes cool and bright, and said, "You are dripping on my property. Go back for the second trunk, now." The second trunk waited where the coachman had left it, half under the open sky, and half in the runnel of water that raced along the cobbles. It was a travelling chest of walnut with brass corners, packed for a week that would stretch to 2, because Lady Kelly never travelled with less than 6 gowns and 2 evening wraps, even when she claimed economy. Victoria bent her knees and tried to lift from the handles, as her father had taught her when she was small and determined to carry books twice her size. The trunk shifted and did not rise. Her stomach cramped hard enough to blur the edges of the arcade for a moment. She set the bandbox on the driest stone she could find, tucked her elbows in, and tried again. This time the chest came clear of the ground by an inch, then 2. The rainwater that had soaked her shoes by 9 o'clock had chilled her toes to numbness. Now each step felt as though she were walking on split wood. She crossed the lane in short movements, resting the trunk against her shin twice before she reached the awning. No one moved to take it from her. A footman with Kelly colours on his sleeve stood near the carriage step and pretended to adjust a strap. He had been instructed once not to assist her unless commanded. Lady Kelly disliked visible kindness where Victoria was concerned. Kindness suggested duty, and duty cost money. At 11 her knuckles opened. The split began at the right index finger, where old wool rubbed over damp skin, and deepened when she tightened her grip around a leather case of hat pins. The pain came hot, then cold. Rain found the cut and made it burn. She shifted the case to her left hand and felt the same sting there. 2 cracked lines crossing the base of her thumb like badly drawn ink. She did not ask for lint. She did not ask for thread to bind the skin. Asking had a ledger attached to it in Lady Kelly's mind, and every request increased what Victoria supposedly owed for roof, bread, and tolerance. She carried parcels from one end of the arcade to the other, while the daughters inspected ribbons under shelter and rejected colours they had selected an hour earlier. She stood in line at the pastry stall to secure a box of sugared buns she would not be permitted to taste. She waited at the apothecary door for cough drops and smelling salts, then was told she had taken too long and should have run. Her wet hem dragged against stone, gathered grit, and darkened. A boy with ink on his cuff stared openly at her hands, then at the signet stitched on Lady Kelly's reticule, and comprehension crossed his face with unkind speed. A servant then, if not in name. A dependent certainly. A burden, as Lady Kelly called her in front of guests when she wished to produce pity for herself. The inventory of how she had come to this did not live in memory as a sequence. It lived in her body. It lived in the attic room where wind found the gap in the sash each night and lifted the thin blanket from her shoulder. It lived in her shoes, stuffed at the toe with scraps of old linen because the leather had split last winter and never been replaced. It lived in the narrow space behind her left ear, where hunger headaches began as a pulse and spread forward until light itself hurt. Her father had died in late autumn, fever and then silence, before he could answer the creditors who arrived with folded papers and fixed mouths. He had promised she would keep the house on Sydney Place if she remained careful and patient. He had promised that ledgers could be negotiated and mortgages extended if one spoke plainly and on time. Lady Kelly had taken the ledgers first, then the keys, then the study where Victoria had once read beside him while he corrected legal drafts by candlelight. "You are too emotional for accounts," she had said. "You will only worsen matters." Coin from copywork and mending commissions had disappeared from Victoria's workbox within days. Meals were withheld for impertinence so slight it could be invented after the fact. Letters from creditors were placed on a tray in the drawing-room for Lady Kelly's amusement, and then burned unopened. Victoria was forbidden to reply. The shame of that silence sat heavier than hunger. Men who had dealt honourably with her father would believe she ignored them. They would call his name and receive no answer. At noon the rain thickened from steady fall to hard slanting sheets that struck the awning and splashed from carriage roofs in silver arcs. The arcade smelled of wet leather, coal smoke from nearby chimneys, and crushed lavender when Lady Kelly passed. Victoria stood beside stacked parcels and felt cold travel inward, past skin, past muscle, into the narrow line of her spine. She had eaten half a heel of yesterday's bread before dawn in the scullery, standing by the banked kitchen fire while cook looked away and pretended not to notice. That had been all. Her stomach had moved from ache to a hollow, floating lightness she distrusted. She counted tasks to keep from counting hours to supper, retrieve shawl from milliner, secure receipt from tobacconist, carry bonnet box to carriage, return for umbrella left at draper's, stand ready for further instruction. A carriage wheel struck a rut and sent a fan of dirty water across the hem of her dress. One of the daughters clicked her tongue. "Look at her, she resembles a dock porter." Lady Kelly adjusted a cuff and replied, "Porters are paid." The remark was quiet. It landed anyway. Victoria kept her expression smooth and lowered the bonnet box into the carriage as though her hands were not shaking. The driver glanced down once, quickly, when he saw the tremor, and then fixed his eyes on the horses. Words were the one inheritance no one had managed to strip from her, and she protected them as if they were coin. Beneath the soaked pelisse, tucked inside the bodice lining she had stitched herself, rested a narrow notebook wrapped in waxed cloth. Its pages held copied legal phrases in her father's hand for the first 20 leaves, and in her own for the rest. Terms of settlement, clauses of conveyance, remedies for breach, cautions he had insisted she memorize even when Lady Kelly laughed at the lessons. "Why burden a girl with law?" she used to ask at dinner while his health still held. "She will marry and forget every word." He had smiled then, tired and kind. "She remembers what matters." The memory came now with such force that Victoria's eyes stung. She blinked once and looked toward the far end of the arcade where rain turned the street to moving slate. She would not cry in public. She had done that once, in the first month after his death, and Lady Kelly had called it performance. Victoria had learned quickly. Tears were a luxury too easily weaponized. She adjusted the bandbox against her hip and shifted her weight off the foot that had gone numb in wet leather. When Lady Kelly turned and called her name again, sharp as a snapped thread, Victoria answered at once and stepped back into the rain to fetch what was left. What was left proved to be 3 packages from the bookseller, a cedar chest of hair ribbons, and a tin of imported tea that Lady Kelly trusted to no hand but hers when there was danger of denting. Victoria gathered them against her damp sleeves and crossed from awning to carriage through water that slapped at her ankles, then back again when Lady Kelly remembered a fan left at the glove merchant, and sent her for that as well. Each errand lasted only minutes. Each minute lengthened the cold. The gloves on her hands had gone from wet to heavy, and the split skin at her knuckles had begun to stiffen where blood and rain mixed to a thin rust-coloured smear. She tucked her fingers inward to hide it when passers-by looked, then stopped trying, because there was no practical way to carry polished boxes and preserve dignity at once. She moved as quickly as the parcels allowed. She kept her head lowered. She listened for the tone that meant Lady Kelly wanted her near enough to be corrected. Near the arcade entrance, 2 matrons paused beneath a striped umbrella and stared openly while Victoria balanced the cedar box against one hip and adjusted the slipping tea tin with her chin. One asked, not quietly, whether the girl was new staff. The other answered that no staff would be so poorly shod. Their eyes slid to Lady Kelly, and Lady Kelly smiled with delicate fatigue, as though burdened by charity itself. "My husband's daughter," she said. "We do what we can." The words settled on Victoria's skin more harshly than the rain. Her father had once paid both women's subscription dues when one widow's accounts had gone short after Michaelmas. She remembered his hand writing the notes of extension, his voice saying that reputation was built by quiet acts. No one applauded. She remembered standing at his desk small enough that the edge struck her chest while he guided her finger across a page and taught her to read names before sums. The same names now turned away from her under bright umbrellas, as if she carried a contagion. The reduction had happened 1 sentence at a time. First, poor thing, then unfortunate girl, then dependent, then relation. By the end of winter, even the cook's boy, who had known her since she was 14, called her Miss only when Lady Kelly could hear. Her mother had died when Victoria was 9, in a bedroom that smelled of beeswax and vinegar and rosemary boiled too long. The house on Sydney Place had quieted around that loss like a church between bells. Her father had not spoken much for a year after, yet he had kept his promises with stubborn precision. He sat beside her at supper, even when he barely ate. He ordered French primers and a worn Latin grammar from London because she had asked what the legal words on his desk meant. He allowed her into the study on condition that she touched no signed paper, then broke his own rule by letting her sharpen his quills while he dictated letters. The man had not known how to mother, but he had known how to teach. Numbers, clauses, the architecture of obligation. She had loved him for the way he never softened truth to spare her. When he remarried, she had been 16 and hopeful enough to mistake polish for kindness. Lady Kelly arrived with 2 daughters, 2 maids, trunks of silk, and a smile that never reached her eyes. For the first month there had been dinners with candles in every branch and laughter that sounded rehearsed. Victoria had tried to please. She offered her late mother's cameo for the elder daughter to wear at an assembly. She gave up the brighter bedchamber because the younger claimed draughts in the east wing made her cough. She moved her books to the schoolroom shelf to make space for Lady Kelly's imported porcelain spaniels. Each concession had been presented as temporary. Nothing temporary was ever returned. By Christmas, the cameo had vanished into a jewel case she was not permitted to open. By spring, her mother's walnut escritoire stood in the younger sister's room, with a lace cover draped over the scratches, where Victoria had once carved her initials with a hairpin. By midsummer, the study itself belonged to Lady Kelly's callers from noon onward, and Victoria's presence there was called intrusive, then ungrateful, then obscene. She learned to read in passageways, standing by windows where the light lasted longest. She learned to eat quickly when food appeared, because it might not appear twice. Debts did not ruin the house in one dramatic blow. They came as folded papers with neat seals, as polite inquiries that grew formal, then sharp. Her father's practice had always run close. He extended credit to men whose pride outran their means, and collected late because he disliked pressing widows and retired captains. After a failed investment in canal shares and 2 clients who died before settlement, his ledgers grew crowded with promises and thin-on coin. He worked later. His cough worsened. He assured Victoria again and again that liquidity could be managed if one kept correspondence honest and punctual. Then fever took him in 10 days. On the 3rd day after burial, Lady Kelly requested the keys on the grounds of order. On the 5th, she announced that all communications would pass through her for propriety. On the 7th, Victoria found her father's account books removed from the study and stacked in Lady Kelly's dressing room, where lavender sachets lay between pages of unpaid notes. "You distress yourself needlessly," Lady Kelly said, when Victoria asked to answer a creditor in Bristol who had sent condolences with his bill. "Business is no sphere for girls who cry." Victoria had not cried. She had stood still until her jaw ached, then curtsied because refusal would have been named defiance. Coin she earned by mending lace cuffs for a neighbour disappeared from the kitchen jar, where she hid it beneath tea leaves. A half-crown given by old Mr. Davies for copying a legal petition was removed from her sewing basket while she fetched water. When she asked the housemaid if anyone had seen it, Lady Kelly heard and laughed in front of both daughters. "Listen to her," she said. "One would think we were thieves in our own house." The daughters repeated the line at luncheon for a week. Penalties gathered from thin air, a stained cuff, an answered question in the wrong tone, a delay of 2 minutes at table, supper withheld, fire denied in the attic because coal must be conserved, New boots for the daughters ordered from London, while Victoria's cracked shoes were stuffed with old linen and declared serviceable. Her father's watch, promised to her in his own hand, was sold quietly, then denied. His law books were boxed for auction, except those Lady Kelly found decorative enough to line a shelf in the morning room. The world outside saw only sensible economies. Inside, the economies were surgical. Reduce her food, reduce her sleep, reduce her claim to space, reduce memory until gratitude looked like the only respectable posture left. By the first week of November, she had learned the rhythm of humiliation so precisely that she could predict it by the rustle of Lady Kelly's skirt before words were spoken. Praise in company, correction in corridors, orders delivered as though they were favours. That afternoon, at the arcade, with rain striking stone and carriage lamps lit early against the dark, the pattern repeated, without variation. Lady Kelly accepted greetings and condolences for the burden she carried. The daughters tried on gloves and passed their rejected pairs directly into Victoria's wet hands. "Hold these, not like that. You crease everything." A commissionaire offered to carry 2 boxes to the carriage, and was waved away because expenditure had become a moral principle when it concerned anyone but them. Victoria's stomach tightened, then eased into a dull, dangerous quiet. She had reached the point where hunger no longer gnawed. It floated. She recognized the sign and adjusted her breathing to keep dizziness from rising. Through the open door of the bookseller she glimpsed the corner of a legal digest she had read with her father 3 winters before, and for a moment the ache in her throat was almost physical. She could still hear him turning pages with ink-stained fingers. She could still hear him say that language bound men harder than iron when it was written correctly, witnessed properly, and read by someone who refused to be frightened by titles. Lady Kelly had taken his keys, his room, his silver, his timepiece, and nearly every object touched by his hand. She had not taken the lesson. Victoria shifted the parcels, felt the hidden notebook press warm and flat against her ribs, despite the cold, and steadied herself with that private fact. When Lady Kelly called once more for the final errand, sending her along Milsom Street to recover a parcel left at the milliner's counter, Victoria stepped back into the weather, shoes full of icy water, fingers split and burning, carrying another woman's purchases through a city that still remembered her father's name and did not yet remember her own. Victoria had just turned into the narrow run of Milsom Street, chin tucked against the rain and parcels stacked so high against her chest that she could only see the ground a few steps ahead, when the street split open with noise. A crack like gunfire snapped through the weather. A horse screamed. Iron struck stone with a sound that jarred through her teeth. The phaeton ahead of her pitched sideways as its near wheel sheared at the hub, one spoke spinning loose into the gutter. A groom shouted for space. Someone cried out. The pair of bays lunged against twisted traces and dragged the carriage half around before one animal slipped and went to its knees. The street, which had been orderly misery a breath before, became a tangle of hooves, mud, and frightened bodies. Victoria did not remember deciding to move. The bandbox hit the cobbles first, then the tea tin, then the wrapped parcel from the milliner that burst open and bled pale ribbon into brown water. She was already running. Rain struck her face hard enough to sting. Her ruined shoes slid once, caught, and drove her forward again. A stable boy lay near the lamp-post, coat torn, one arm folded wrong beneath him, while he fought for breath through clenched teeth. He could not have been more than 11. A gentleman in a military greatcoat had dropped beside him, dark hair plastered by rain, one side of his brow opened by impact and running red into the corner of his eye. He reached for the boy's shoulder with one hand and turned at the same moment she knelt in the mud. "Leave him! Stand back!" The command came low and edged, a voice trained to be obeyed before thought. Victoria had already set her fingers along the injured arm, searching for the break through soaked sleeve and shaking muscle. "If I stand back, he loses the use of it." She heard her own answer as if spoken by someone else, clear and without apology. She tore at the inner seam of her petticoat with wet, numb hands until linen gave way, then braced the arm against her palm and bound above and below the fracture as her father had taught her with kindling sticks and old bandages in winter evenings she had believed would last forever. The boy made a thin, strangled sound and tried to jerk free. "Look at me," she said, leaning close so he could see only her face and not the angle of his own limb. "Breathe now, slow. You are not dying." "Keep your eyes on mine!" Around them, boots splashed and voices rose, but she narrowed the world to pulse, bone, pressure, not. By the time she cinched the second strip, the horses were under control and 2 grooms were cutting tangled leather from the wrecked wheel. Rain pooled in the hollow at her collarbone and ran down her spine. Her hands trembled only when she paused. The man beside her stood in one clean movement despite the blood on his temple and the mud at his knees, then crouched again to her level as if to test what he had seen. He was tall, even bent down, broad through shoulder and chest, his jaw cut hard as quarried stone. A pale scar crossed from ear to cheek, white against cold skin. His eyes were a winter grey she had seen only on the river just before ice took it. He did not offer thanks. He looked once at the improvised binding, once at the boy's steadier breathing, then at Victoria's hands where rain had washed the rust from her split knuckles and left the cracks raw. His gaze moved to the bruise-darkened mark above her wrist where Lady Kelly's grip had landed 2 nights earlier, to the frayed cuff, to the seam she had ripped from her own underlayer without hesitation. "Who taught you splinting?" Not a question in tone, though shaped as one. "My father, sir. He read medicine when he could not afford physicians." She realised she was kneeling in street mud before an unknown gentleman, and rose too quickly. Dizziness tilted the lamps. She steadied herself with one palm against the lamppost, and nearly laughed at the absurdity that she still held, clenched in her left fist, the silver paper packet of hairpins she had somehow not dropped. A crowd had formed despite rain, held at distance by the sheer force of his presence, and by 2 liveried footmen who had appeared from nowhere and now stood shoulder to shoulder, faces set, one bent toward the gentleman. "Your Grace, the surgeon, has been sent for." The words cut through the weather and rearranged the street. The Duke of Harlwick, even soaked, bleeding and mud-stained, he carried rank like armour no rain could dull. Everyone in Bath knew the name: widower, war hero, cold as January stone, a man whose displeasure could empty a room. Victoria felt the power differential land in her body with the same force as the thunder that rolled somewhere beyond the roofs. She stepped back as far as the fallen parcels allowed and lowered her gaze, because that was what survival required. Harlwick did not look away. Lady Kelly arrived in a rush of lavender silk and indignation, skirts lifted clear of puddles by a maid who had finally been permitted into the rain, now that witness mattered. "Victoria!" Her voice sliced between bodies. "What have you done?" She did not ask whether anyone was hurt. She saw at once the opened milliner parcel in the gutter, the ribbon dragged through mud, the torn edge of Victoria's petticoat visible beneath her wet hem, and outrage sharpened her mouth. She stopped short only when she recognised the Duke. Colour rose beneath powder. She curtsied too quickly. "Your Grace, 1,000 pardons. The girl is clumsy and oversteps. I shall remove her at once." Her gloved fingers closed on Victoria's forearm in a grip meant to bruise later where no one would see. Victoria's breath caught. Holwick's gaze dropped to that hand, then lifted again. His face altered by less than an inch. It was enough. "Remove your hand!" he spoke quietly. The command carried farther than shouting. Lady Kelly released Victoria as if burned, recovered, and gave a brittle smile. "You are very good, Your Grace, but she is my responsibility." "No!" He turned to his steward, who had arrived with a black umbrella and a surgeon's case. "Take the boy to my house. Mr. Wren is to meet us there. Keep the splint as it is." Then, to Victoria, "You will come." The rain seemed suddenly colder. She looked from the injured child now being lifted with painful care onto a porter's board and wrapped against the weather, to Lady Kelly's face gone thin with fury, to the Duke's unreadable expression. "Your Grace, I am expected back at once." It was true and not true. Expected for punishment, for inventory, for another errand. Holwick's jaw tightened. The scar at his cheek pulled. "You are expected where the injured are treated by competent hands." Lady Kelly stepped forward again, silk whispering, perfume sharp as rot beneath flowers. "This is a private family matter. It became public when your family struck a hazard into open traffic and left this child to luck." He did not raise his voice. "If Miss Kelly had followed your wishes, he would be in greater pain and poorer odds." Lady Kelly's daughters hovered under a servant's umbrella, watching with bright, avid eyes that gleamed at scandal. Passers-by pretended not to listen and listened to every syllable. A quarter-hour later, with afternoon already collapsing toward a dim early dusk, Victoria sat opposite the Duke of Holwick, in a closed carriage that smelled of wet wool, leather polish, and iron from his blood. She had been given no opportunity to collect the dropped packages. A footman had gathered what could be salvaged and sent the rest to Lady Kelly's carriage with a note she had not been permitted to read. Her own clothes clung and chilled. Mud striped her hem. Her hands rested in her lap to stop their shaking, though each rut in the road made the pain in her knuckles flare anew. Holwick had refused bandaging in the street. Blood had tracked from brow to jaw and dried there in a dark line now broken by rainwater that slipped from his hair. He sat with one boot braced, greatcoat open at the throat, hat set aside. There was no softness in him. There was exhaustion, tightly leashed. For several streets he said nothing. Wheels hissed over wet stone. The carriage lamps cast brief gold across shop-front glass, and then lost it to rain again. Victoria kept her gaze on the floorboards because looking directly at a duke invited interpretation, and she had no room left for further mistakes. "Name," he said at last. "Victoria Kelly, Your Grace. Age, 22. Any formal training. No, Your Grace. Yet you set fractures. I have seen 3, assisted with 1. My father instructed me in bindings for carriage falls and field injuries from his military clients." He studied her for a moment that felt longer than the ride. "You speak as if reading from a brief." The answer escaped before caution could smooth it. "I copied briefs for him when I was younger." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Something nearer acknowledgement. "You are shaking." "I am cold, Your Grace. And hungry." She looked up then, startled by the bluntness. His eyes had not moved from her face. He had seen the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the slight lag when she answered, the unsteadiness she could no longer hide. Shame burned hot enough to push back the chill. "I am well enough." "Liar!" The word was flat, without cruelty and without mercy. "Your gloves are split. Your hands are raw. You nearly fell when you stood. You have not eaten properly today." She could not deny any piece of it. She chose silence and hated that it resembled submission. Outside, rain thickened against the carriage roof like thrown gravel. Holwick leaned back a fraction and closed his eyes for 2 breaths, as though bracing against something internal she could not name. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher. "When we arrive, Mr. Wren will examine the boy. You will state exactly what you did in order. You will remain until he wakes, or the surgeon dismisses you." A command posed as logistics. No invitation, no room to refuse without consequence she could not calculate. She thought of Lady Kelly waiting at the townhouse, of the missing parcels, of the penalties that would follow, and then of the boy's face, contorted with pain, easing by degrees, once the splint held. "Yes, Your Grace." He opened his eyes. "Does she strike you often?" The question landed with such precision that for a moment she forgot to breathe. She stared at him, then at her own wrist, where the bruise sat like ink under wet skin. There were answers that preserved peace. There were answers that preserved truth. She had learned they were rarely the same. "My household disciplines according to its own judgment," she said carefully. "Not your household," he said. "Not any more this evening?" The carriage slowed. Through the rain-streaked glass she saw iron gates open on black hinges. Then a broad sweep of drive rising toward a stone facade lit by lanterns and pale window light. Holwick House stood severe and immense, its symmetry almost forbidding in the storm, every line declaring order and power. Footmen in dark livery ran forward as the carriage stopped. One opened the door and lowered the step. Cold air rushed in, carrying wet earth and coal smoke. Holwick descended first, then turned and offered his gloved hand without flourish, without deference, as if extending an instruction rather than aid. Victoria hesitated 1 heartbeat, hearing Lady Kelly's voice, in memory, and her father's beneath it, steadier, telling her to read the terms before she signed anything, spoken or written. She set her hand in the Duke's and stepped down into the rain anyway. The cold struck first when she entered, then heat struck harder. Holwick House swallowed the rain behind her with the heavy close of doors, and the sudden warmth from banked grates bit into her wet skin until her hands shook in sharp, uncontrollable tremors. Black and white marble ran the length of the entrance hall. Water dripped from her hem and made a dark trail across stone that looked too polished for anyone in mud-streaked shoes. Footman glanced once at her face, then at the Duke, and looked away at once. "Nursery wing," Holwick said. No one asked whom he meant. A maid in grey led, quick and silent, through 2 corridors panelled in dark oak, and up a back stair that narrowed toward the upper floor. The house smelled of beeswax, coal, and clean linen. Beneath it, faint but urgent, came the metallic scent of blood. The boy lay in a small withdrawing room, converted at speed for treatment, his wet coat cut away, his face chalk pale against a folded blanket. A stable groom stood near the hearth with his cap crushed in both hands. He looked as if he had not yet learned where to place his fear. Victoria crossed at once to the settee where the boy had been laid, reached for his pulse with 2 fingers, and counted under her breath while rain tapped the windows. His eyelids fluttered. "Bram," he whispered, voice cracked, "do not let them beat him." "They will not," she said, though she had no right to promise. "Your horse is tended. Breathe slowly." Bootsteps sounded behind her. The surgeon entered, carrying a case of instruments and a folded apron, silver hair damp at the temples, expression already sharpened for refusal. His gaze moved from the Duke to the splint at the child's arm, and then, with visible scepticism, to Victoria's torn petticoat strip and bleeding knuckles. "Who set this?" he asked. Holwick did not look at the surgeon when he answered. He looked at Victoria. "Miss Kelly." Mr. Wren bent over the binding, fingers gentle, eyes precise. He tested alignment once, then again, and gave a short, surprised breath through his nose. "You held the forearm in traction while rapping?" "Yes, sir." "You kept the elbow flexed. Good." He straightened. "If this had been left as thrown, we would be speaking of permanent deformity by morning." The words landed in the room like a verdict. The groom made a broken sound of relief and wiped his face with the back of his hand. Victoria did not trust herself to speak. She could feel water slipping from her sleeves and gathering at her cuffs. She could feel the ache of hunger, still and deep. Mr. Wren snapped open his case. Hot water, clean lint, 2 smooth boards this length, laudanum measured, not guessed, and someone hold that lamp steady. The maid hurried for water. The groom bolted toward the corridor for boards. No one moved for the lamp. Victoria took it up. She stood at the head of the settee while Mr. Wren cut away the soaked sleeve and reset what rain and impact had jarred. The boy cried out once, a hoarse animal sound that tightened every muscle in her back. She lowered the lamp to keep the light clear of his eyes and gave him her free hand to grip. His fingers were small and cold and stronger than he knew. He clutched hard enough to reopen the cracks in her skin. She did not pull away. "Look at me," she said softly. "Not there. At me. Count with me." He shook his head, jaw locked. "Then listen. 1, 2, 3. She counted in Latin after 10, because the rhythm had steadied her in other sick rooms years earlier, because her father had once told her that unfamiliar words could draw pain into order when fear made ordinary language useless. The boy's breathing dragged, then eased by fractions. Mr. Wren bound wood and linen around the arm in firm, practiced turns. When he finished, he stepped back and nodded once, curt approval reserved for necessity. Only then did Victoria realise the Duke had not left. He stood near the door, greatcoat removed, shirt collar open, blood dried at one temple in a narrow, dark line. He had not moved while the splint was redone. Rain still marked his boots. His face gave nothing away. "Your Grace," Mr. Wren said, turning, "you require stitches." "Later." "Now," Wren said flatly. Holwick ignored him and addressed Victoria instead. "What did you see at the street?" She kept one hand on the child's shoulder as she answered. "Wheel failure at the near hub. Sudden yaw to the left. The child was thrown against iron, not run down." "Could he have prevented it?" "No, Your Grace." The surgeon glanced between them. "I require no legal deposition tonight." "You may require one tomorrow," Holwick said. Mr. Wren made a sound of irritation that held old familiarity rather than fear. "Then tomorrow can wait until I close your brow." A quarter-hour later, after stitches and bandages and more commands than comfort, the room settled into a strained quiet. The boy slept under an opiate haze, pulse rapid but regular. Mr. Wren wrote instructions in a slanted, impatient hand and handed them first to the housekeeper, then, after a pointed pause, to Victoria. "Cloth to the forehead every 15 minutes. Small sips only if he wakes. If fever spikes sharply, send for me at once. Do not let him thrash that arm." "I understand," she said. "You will not sleep," he replied. "I did not intend to." Holwick dismissed the room with a glance. Servants filed out, soft shoes on carpet, door clicking shut behind them, until only the 3 of them remained. The surgeon closed his case, then paused at the threshold. "She is right to keep him warm, Your Grace. Not overheated, warm. I heard her." Mr. Wren looked as though he might say more. He did not. He left. Silence returned, broken only by fire and rain. Victoria adjusted the blanket around the boy's shoulders and wrung water from the edge of her sleeve onto a folded cloth at her feet. She did not look at Holwick. She could feel him there, large and still, like a wall shifted one pace closer. At last he said, "You will be given dry clothes." "I cannot wear your household's garments." "You can. You will." She had no answer that did not sound ungrateful or afraid. Both would be true. She settled for "Thank you, Your Grace." A knock came, quick and uncertain. A footman entered carrying a silver tray with a calling card and a folded note sealed in green wax. He held both out to the Duke with rigid care, as if the paper might ignite. "For Miss Kelly, Your Grace, brought by Lady Kelly's man. He waits below." Hallwyck broke the seal. His eyes moved once across the page. The corner of his mouth hardened. "Read it," he said, and handed it to Victoria. She took the note with damp fingers and forced herself through the neat, slanted lines. "Return immediately. You have exceeded every limit of propriety and cost me property in the street. If you do not present yourself within the half hour, consider yourself turned out without reference or shelter." The signature was a flourish of authority. Victoria folded the note along the original crease and passed it back. Her face felt oddly calm. Turned out. The threat had hung in every corridor for months. Seeing it written changed less than she expected. Hallwyck gave the paper to the fire without looking at it again. The wax hissed. The handwriting blackened and curled. "To Lady Kelly's messenger," he told the footman. "You will say Miss Kelly remains here at my direction as witness in an injury matter. She will return when I release her, not before." The footman bowed and withdrew. Victoria stared at the grate where the last edge of green wax melted into ash. "You have made this more difficult for me." "Yes," he said it without apology. She turned back to the sleeping boy. "Then I ought to thank you and resent you in the same breath." "Do what is accurate." The answer was so dry it almost approached wit. Almost. She looked up despite herself. His mouth didn't move. Time stretched. She kept the cloths cool. She counted pulse. She shifted the lamp lower when the boy flinched at brightness. Once he woke enough to whimper for his mother, then sank again. No one came from that side of his life. Victoria did not ask whether there was one to send for. An hour past midnight, the rain eased from hard assault to steady fall. Somewhere below, a clock struck one. The sound travelled through floor and plaster like a measured warning. Victoria rose stiffly, set fresh cloth at the child's temple, and stepped into the corridor to rinse the basin. The upper hall stood empty. Candlelight pooled at intervals on the runner and left the spaces between in muted shadow. As she moved toward the service stair, voices drifted from below, low and strained. "Kitchen fire is near out." "Cook has not touched a thing since supper was sent up untouched." "Stable lads are still waiting." "They can wait." "They have been in wet coats for 4 hours." Victoria paused with the basin in both hands. Hunger moved inside her like a hook. She could return to the sick room. She could let hierarchy settle itself. She could do what was prudent. She went down. The kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house and brighter, copper pans catching hearth light in dull crescents. A pot of broth sat thickening at the edge of the range, neglected long enough to form skin. 2 scullery maids stood near the door, uncertain whether they were permitted to serve while the upper floors remained in alarm. A groom with mud to his knees waited beside a bench, eyes hollow with fatigue. "Where is cook?" Victoria asked. "Pantry," one maid said. "Crying, miss." "Over the boy." Victoria set down the basin, found a ladle, and skimmed the broth. "Bring bowls. 4 first, then more." The maid stared. "Now!" she said, more sharply than she intended. They moved. She worked quickly. hands remembering motions learned in narrower kitchens and colder winters, broth into bowls, bread cut thick, a pinch of salt from the crock near the stove. She sent the first tray to the stable lads, the second to the grooms, the third to the maids who had been standing too long on sore feet and duty. When a tray appeared for her, she passed it to the youngest groom instead. He looked barely older than the injured child and tried to refuse out of manners drilled hard into poverty. "Take it," she said. "You cannot hold reins at dawn if you shake." He took it with both hands. By the time she rinsed the ladle, the room had quieted into the practical sounds of people eating who had not expected to. The scullery maid nearest the door gave her a look of startled gratitude and then, remembering rank confusion, dropped her eyes at once. Victoria dried her hands on her wet skirt and turned back toward the stairs. Holwick stood in the doorway. He had removed his coat entirely. Bandage crossed his brow in clean linen. His shirt sleeves were rolled once at the forearm, exposing a long white scar near the wrist. He said nothing for a moment. His gaze moved from the empty tray in the groom's hands to Victoria's untouched bowl still cooling by the hearth. "I told them to feed you," he said. "They were all waiting." "I did not ask for an explanation." "No," she said quietly. "You did not." His jaw set. "Sit, eat." "I cannot leave the boy long." "You can leave him for 6 minutes." It was a command. It was also unmistakably care dressed in iron. She sat because refusing now would spend strength she needed elsewhere. The broth was plain and hot and almost painfully good. She managed half before her stomach protested the sudden warmth. Holwick remained by the door, not entering fully, not leaving. He watched until she took another spoonful. Then he turned away without a word and climbed toward the upper floor. By the second grey hour before dawn, the rain thinned to mist against the windows. Candle stubs had burned low. Victoria's shoulders ached from the fixed posture of vigilance. The boy's fever climbed, then hovered. She changed cloth after cloth until her fingers numbed from cool water. At intervals he muttered disjointed fragments about harness buckles, about being late, about Bram rearing at nothing. Each time she answered in the same calm tone, naming what was true and immediate. "You are in bed. Your arm is set. You are safe enough for now." Near dawn, he began to thrash, not hard, not with full strength, enough to endanger the splint. Victoria caught his good wrist and leaned close, dark hair falling loose from pins that had surrendered hours earlier. "Stay still! Hear me! Stay with me!" His eyes opened wide but unfocused. Tears slipped sideways into his hairline. "They will dismiss me," he whispered. "Wheel broke. I checked it. I did check." She could have offered comfort without risk. She could have murmured that all would be well and left truth to men with titles. Instead, she said, "The wheel failed at the hub in rain. You did not cause rotten wood." The door stood slightly ajar for air. She did not hear it move. She only felt at her back the subtle change of presence and knew someone had entered. She kept her eyes on the child. "Listen to my voice," she said. "You will breathe in for 4 counts, then out. Do not fight the pain. Follow me." She counted again, low and steady, first in English, then in the Latin cadence that had carried him through the setting of bone. His breathing matched hers by degrees. The tremor in his shoulders eased. She began to hum when words ran out. An old hymn her father had once used to time his own breath through coughing nights, simple and grave and almost without melody. The boy slept. Only then did she straighten and turn. Holwick stood just inside the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, face unreadable in the pale, reluctant light. He looked from the child to Victoria, to the damp cloths piled in a basin, to the untouched blanket folded at the foot of the chair where she had clearly not sat for hours. "You have been awake all night," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "And you chose to promise him his place?" "I chose not to lie." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Good," he said, "because he keeps it." Victoria looked back at the sleeping boy, then at the Duke again. The room smelled of rain-damp linen and cooling wax. Her hands were shaking once more, from fatigue now rather than cold. Harwick's expression did not soften, but neither did it close. "When Mr. Wren returns," he said, "you will give your account before him and my steward. Every detail. Then you will sleep." It was another order shaped like protection. It was also the first time anyone in that room had spoken of her testimony as something that might matter beyond the hour. She bowed her head once. "As you command, Your Grace." He gave one brief nod, as if he had expected no other answer, and crossed to the bedside. The child slept with his mouth slightly open, lashes dark against fever-pale skin, splintered arm secured in fresh linen. Holwick stood over him without touching him. His height made the small room seem narrower. Dawn found the angles of his face and made the scar at his cheek look almost silver. Victoria waited for dismissal that did not come. He remained where he was, one hand braced on the bedpost, eyes fixed on the boy's breathing. Bootsteps sounded in the corridor. "Mister?" Wren entered first, carrying steam from the stairwell on his coat, his leather case under one arm and a folded sheaf of papers under the other. Behind him came Mr. Dane, Holwick's steward, spare and grey-haired, with ink on his cuffs and a magistrate's clerk at his shoulder. The clerk set down a writing board and 2 stoppered bottles, one of ink and one of sand for drying. He glanced at Victoria's wet skirt, then at the Duke, and straightened at once. "Pulse?" Wren asked. Victoria answered without looking away from the child. "Faster near dawn. It settled after cooling cloths. No vomiting. He woke twice in confusion. Arm has remained aligned." Wren touched the boy's forehead, then unwrapped and rewrapped the splint with professional speed. "Good. Fever, but not a runaway." He looked up at Victoria. "You kept him from wrenching the fracture." I held the shoulder and spoke until he followed breath. Wren's brows rose. "In Latin, if my man heard correctly." She could not decide whether to be embarrassed by that detail. "It gave him countenance cadence." "It gave him discipline," Holwick said. The words were quiet. They landed in the room with the weight of judgment. Mr. Dane cleared his throat respectfully and opened his ledger. "Your Grace, if it pleases you, we should take Miss Kelly's statement while events are fresh. The magistrate will want sequence, witnesses, and any observations of mechanical fault." Holwick did not move from the bedpost. "Take it." The clerk drew his pen. Victoria folded her hands to hide the tremor in her fingers and spoke as her father had taught her to speak when facts mattered more than comfort. She gave the time by street bell. She gave weather conditions. She gave carriage direction, horse response, angle of turn, sound of the brake at the near hub. She described the child's position when thrown, the location of impact, her first assessment of pulse and limb, the improvised materials used for temporary splinting, and the order of interventions before the surgeon arrived. She did not embellish. She did not soften Lady Kelly's attempt to remove her from the scene. She did not mention hunger, cold, fear, or shame. When the clerk asked whether she had expertise in wheel construction, she answered, "No, but rotten timber and clean shear do not look alike," and described the splintered grain she had seen protruding from the failed spoke. By the second page of testimony, the room had gone very still. "Mister," Dane lifted his eyes. "You observed grain separation under lacquer in active rain?" "Yes." "You are certain?" "Yes, sir." The steward shut his ledger with care. "Then I shall send for the wheelwright this morning and preserve the carriage remains before alteration." Holwick finally turned from the boy. "Not this morning, now." "Your Grace, it is barely dawn." "Now," he repeated, "and send a man to the arcade where parcels were dropped. Retrieve what remains. Catalogue everything before Lady Kelly's household can alter claims." Victoria looked up sharply. She had not told him the parcels might be used against her. He had inferred it from one wet hour and one note in green wax. Mr. Dane's expression shifted by a degree, respect edged with surprise. "At once, Your Grace." Wren finished knotting the bandage and stepped back. "Miss Kelly, you have done enough for one night. You will lie down before you fall where you stand." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, then closed it when the room tipped very slightly around the edges. She reached for the chair back and found it with less certainty than she preferred. Holwick noticed. He noticed everything. "You will sleep in the blue chamber adjoining the nursery," he said. She shook her head before caution could catch her. "I cannot accept a guest room while I am here under necessity. A maid's truckle or chair in the corridor is sufficient." "You are not a servant in this house." The sentence came flat and immediate, with no room for interpretation. She felt the old reflex rise anyway. "In my own house I am treated as one. It is difficult to alter habit in a night." His gaze held hers. "Then alter it now." Wren muttered something under his breath that might have been approval. Mr. Dane looked discreetly at the window, as if he had developed sudden interest in rain. Victoria sensed the social line she stood on thin as wire. If she stepped wrong, she would be accused of presumption. If she stepped back, she would be swallowed again by the posture that had kept her alive and nearly erased her. She chose the narrow middle. "I will rest where you direct, Your Grace, after the child takes broth and keeps it." "Good," Wren said, "because if either of you argues further, I shall dose you both." For 1 second, Holwick's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile. Then the expression was gone. By the time the clock in the lower hall struck 6, the rain had reduced to a fine grey mist against the nursery panes. A tray arrived with barley broth, watered wine for disinfecting cloth, and 2 slices of bread. Victoria coaxed 3 spoonfuls into the boy between bouts of sleep and pain, waiting each time for his stomach to settle. When he whispered that he would be dismissed for damaging a nobleman's equipage, she answered with the same precision she had used for his splint. "You will not be dismissed for surviving an accident you did not cause." He stared as if the idea were too large to hold, then let his eyes close again. Wren checked the pulse once more and gathered his case. "If fever spikes beyond this, send for me. If he sleeps, let him." He paused at the door, then looked back at Victoria. "Do not be heroic. Heroics are for battlefields and fools." She nearly said she had not been either. She was too tired to pretend. "Yes, sir." After he left, Mr. Dane returned with fresh pages for signature and a sealed note from the magistrate confirming receipt of preliminary statement. The clerk dusted each sheet with sand, shook the grains free, and held out the quill. Victoria signed her name in an even hand. Seeing the letters appear on legal paper gave her a strange, sharp steadiness. She had spent months being spoken over, renamed, reduced to relation burden, mouth to feed. Ink contradicted all of that. Ink recorded. Mr. Dane blotted the signature and bowed slightly. "Miss Kelly, your testimony will be entered with formal weight." Before she could answer, rapid steps approached. A footman halted at the threshold, breathless despite his training. "Your Grace, a carriage from Sydney Place. Lady Kelly is in it. She requests immediate audience and demands the return of her stepdaughter. The room seemed to contract around the words. Victoria's stomach tightened so fast she felt briefly sick. Holwick did not look at her. He looked at the footman. "Where is she?" "At the front steps, Your Grace. She has brought both daughters." "Keep them there." The footman hesitated, then nodded, and withdrew. Victoria rose from the bedside because remaining seated felt like surrender. "I should go down. If I do not, she will claim abduction." "You will not go down." "My presence may reduce the scene." "It will increase it." He stepped closer, near enough that she could see the faint roughness of fresh stitches at his brow. "You are a witness in a pending injury inquiry. You are under my protection until the magistrate hears you." The phrase struck her as legal language, exact and deliberate. Under my protection, not pity, not favour. A status that could be defended in writing. She met his eyes and heard her own voice come out lower than she expected. "Do you understand what that declaration costs you? Socially?" "Yes." "Lady Kelly will spread every rumour she can purchase." "Yes." "She will say I contrived this, that I trapped you." This time his answer was one word. "Let her." Something in her chest shifted, not gently. Fear remained. Hunger remained. Exhaustion pressed at her bones. But beneath all of it came a dangerous warmth she did not trust because she wanted it. From the drive below came the faint, unmistakable rise of Lady Kelly's voice carried through open stone and stairwell. Sharp, indignant, accustomed to compliance. Holwick turned toward the door. "Stay with the boy," he said. It was a command. It was also a shield. He left before she could respond. The corridor swallowed his steps with military economy, fast and controlled. Victoria stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, then moved to the window that overlooked the front court. She kept to the side of the curtain where she could see without being seen. Lady Kelly stood on the lower steps in lavender travelling silk despite the weather, veil pinned high, posture immaculate with rage. Her daughters clustered behind her beneath a servant's umbrella, faces bright with grievance. 2 footmen barred the entrance, respectful and immovable. Holwick emerged at the top of the steps bareheaded, coat unfastened, as if he had not considered that rain might touch him. Lady Kelly began speaking the instant she saw him, one gloved hand slicing the air. Victoria could not catch every word through glass, but she heard enough. Impropriety, insolence, family authority, stolen servant. Holwick listened without visible reaction. When she reached toward his sleeve as if to force intimacy into the argument, he stepped back by half a pace and spoke. The court stilled. Even through distance and weather, Victoria heard the line because he gave it in the same clipped register as command on a battlefield. "Miss Kelly is a legal witness and remains at Holwick House by my order." Lady Kelly's mouth tightened. She answered with what looked like a threat, chin lifted, shoulders squared. Holwick said something short in reply and extended his hand to Mr. Dane, who had appeared with a document case. The steward passed him a folded paper sealed in black. Holwick handed it down the steps to Lady Kelly without descending, without bowing, without softening. Victoria knew that paper by shape and handling. Notice of seizure, ledger warrant, magistrate authority. Lady Kelly took it, opened it, read one line and went visibly pale beneath powder. The daughters leaned in, then recoiled as if the ink itself burned. Holwick did not move. Rain gathered at his hairline and fell in a steady line to his collar. He waited while Lady Kelly read the full notice, then gave one final instruction to the footmen. They did not escort her by force. They did not need to. The social ground under her feet had shifted and she knew it. She snapped the paper closed, turned too sharply, and descended to her carriage with silk rustling like dry leaves. The daughters followed. Wheels struck wet stone and rolled away. Victoria remained at the window until the carriage passed beyond the gate. When she turned back, she found the boy awake and watching her with fever-bright eyes. "Was that her?" he whispered. "The lady who shouted?" "It was. Will they send me away?" "No, you said that before. And I was right before." He considered that with grave effort. "You sound like him." "Like whom?" "The Duke, when he says no." She had no answer for that. Minutes later, Hulwick returned, closing the door softly behind him so as not to wake the child if he had slept. His cuffs were damp. There was rain on his shoulders. He did not ask whether she had watched from the window. He knew. "Mister, Dane has dispatched men to Sydney Place with the magistrate's order," he said. "Ledgers, correspondence, wage books and household account chests are to be inventoried before noon." Her breath caught. "You moved that quickly." "I moved at the speed required." He came to the bedside and checked the child's blanket with a practical, almost awkward precision, as if the motion had been learned late and used rarely. The boy looked from one face to the other and drifted back into sleep. Victoria spoke without planning to. "You stood there in the rain and did not move." Hulwick kept his hand on the bedrail. "No." "Why?" His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would refuse. When he answered, his voice was roughened by something harder than fatigue. "Because if I had gone down those steps, I would have said more than law permits." Silence held between them, taut as wire. He looked at her then, fully, with that winter-grey steadiness that missed nothing. "You fed my staff before yourself. You held that boy through the night. You gave sworn testimony without ornament. You were threatened with expulsion and did not recant. I have watched you since Milsom Street. I am done pretending I have not." The words struck like a door closing behind her. He straightened. "Sleep now." She should have obeyed at once. Instead, she heard herself ask, very quietly, "And when I wake, Your Grace?" His answer came without pause, irreversible in its plainness. "When you wake, no one will lay a hand on you again." Victoria did not trust her voice, so she answered him with the smallest nod she could manage, then sat because her knees had begun to sway beneath her, and she refused to fall in front of him. The nursery fire had burned low. Damp grey light pressed at the window panes. Hulwick crossed to the hearth, added coal with deliberate movements, and returned to the bedside as if the act of tending flame required no witness. The child stirred, lashes fluttering, then opened his eyes to narrow slits. "Bram," he whispered. "In the lower stable with a warm mash," Hulwick said, before Victoria could speak. "He has a strained shoulder and a temper. Both are intact." The boy's mouth quivered toward relief. "I checked the wheel, Your Grace. I did." "I know." Hulwick adjusted the blanket by 1 inch. "Sleep again." The child obeyed. Victoria watched the Duke's hand remain on the coverlet for a breath longer than necessity required, then withdraw. That stillness told her more than any speech he could have offered. By 7:30, the house had shifted from night vigilance to morning order. Trays moved in corridors, doors opened and closed with measured quiet. Mr. Dane arrived with 2 sealed packets, rain still bright on his shoulders, and placed them on the nursery table beside the basin of folded cloths. "Your Grace, Miss Kelly." His bow included them both. "The magistrate's officer has completed the first seizure at Sydney Place. Ledgers, account chests, wage books and correspondence are secured under court seal." Lady Kelly attempted protest and was formally cautioned. She is not to remove papers or leave Bath pending hearing. Victoria's hand tightened around the edge of the chair. "And the parcels from the arcade," Dane continued, opening the second packet. Recovered and catalogued. 1 milliner parcel, ruined by rain. 1 tea tin, dented but sealed. 1 band box, intact. Receipts obtained from 3 merchants confirming who purchased and who carried. I thought it prudent. Prudent, a simple word. It felt like being handed breath after months under water. He laid a folded inventory sheet before her. At the bottom, in the clerk's tight script, was a note. No wages paid to Miss Victoria Kelly, despite recorded labour entries over 9 months, subject to magistrate review. Another line rested beneath it, almost an afterthought and therefore more devastating. Pocket notebook of legal extracts removed by Miss Kelly from bodice lining during change of damp clothing, dried and returned unopened at Miss Kelly's request. Dane glanced at the notation. Miss Hart, the maid, wished me to state she did not read a page. She said it with considerable feeling. Victoria swallowed and nodded once. Please thank her for me. I already have. When he withdrew, Harlech reached for the inventory, but did not take it from her hands. You are shaking again. I am furious, she said. It resembles cold. His mouth moved by a fraction. Good. Near 9, Mr. Wren returned and pronounced the child's fever controlled, the splint holding, and the prognosis favourable if rest and discipline were maintained. He looked at Victoria's bandaged knuckles, then at Harlech. She needs clean dressings and sleep more than she needs pride. I agree, Harlech said. Wren snorted softly. Then make her obey. Victoria almost answered that no one made her obey. Fatigue made honesty easier than performance. If I sleep now, I lose the morning hearing. Wren began to object. Harlech lifted one hand, and the surgeon stopped with poor grace. She attends the hearing, Harlech said. Afterward, she sleeps. Wren packed his instruments with clipped efficiency. At the door, he paused. The boy asked whether Miss Kelly would be present when he wakes from his next dose. Victoria looked toward the bed. Tell him yes. Wren grunted approval and left. The magistrate convened in Harlech's lower drawing-room at 10, because weather and injury made travel unreasonable. Coals snapped in the grate. Wet coats steamed near the door. The clerk arranged sand, quills and blotter, while 2 constables stood in dark blue by the mantel, silent and watchful. Lady Kelly arrived under escort, veil lowered, lavender silk exchanged for sober grey that failed to make her look modest. Her daughters were not admitted. They waited in the carriage outside and watched through rain-streaked glass with rigid, pale faces. Lady Kelly saw Victoria at the long table and smiled with careful contempt. How quickly gratitude curdles into ambition! Victoria kept her eyes on the magistrate's seal and did not answer. She had learned at cost that cruelty starved without reply. Statements were taken in sequence. Wheelwright first. Rot under lacquer at the failed hub. Old damage disguised. No fault of the stable boy. Groom second. Maintenance requests submitted and ignored by Kelly household coachmaster for economy. Clerk third. Wage entries in Lady Kelly's books, showing deductions assessed only to Miss Victoria Kelly. No disbursement recorded. Then Victoria copied clauses from her notebook, dates, signatures, 2 forged initials where her father's hand had been imitated badly in haste. She placed the notebook on the green baize table with fingers that no longer trembled. The magistrate, a compact man with iron spectacles and little patience, examined 3 pages and looked up at Lady Kelly. Do you contest the handwriting analysis? Entirely, Lady Kelly said. Mr. Dane slid forward a separate folio. Original correspondence from Mr. Kelly's chambers recovered under seal this morning. Comparable signatures dated 6 months apart. The magistrate compared. His expression cooled further. Contest denied. Lady Kelly turned toward Harlech then. abandoning legal argument for social pressure. "Your Grace, you cannot mean to destroy my family over a servant's fantasies." Holwick stood by the window, one hand behind his back, posture military and exact. Rain streaked the glass beyond him like drawn wire. He did not raise his voice. "Miss Kelly is not your servant. The record now reflects that." Lady Kelly's composure fractured by a clean, audible crack. "She is nothing without my roof." Victoria heard her father's voice in memory. Read the term, name the term, refuse the false one. She met Lady Kelly's stare and spoke evenly. "The roof is mine by settlement deed dated March 1819. You withheld the deed packet in your dressing cabinet behind the rosewood casket. Mr. Dane recovered it this morning." Dane set the packet on the table. The wax seal bore her father's signet, broken and rewrapped. The magistrate opened it, scanned the first page, and passed it to the clerk for entry. The formal decisions came one by one, each dry as dust and more merciful than any plea. Provisional control of Sydney Place restored to Miss Victoria Kelly, pending full probate review. Lady Kelly charged for fraud, coercive withholding of wages, and assault pending trial. Household funds frozen. Daughters permitted personal effects only. No contact order without written leave of the court. Lady Kelly half rose, silk rustling like agitation itself. "This is grotesque." The magistrate did not look up. "This is documented." Two constables stepped forward, not rough, not gentle, final. When they led Lady Kelly out, she threw one last look at Victoria, loaded with hatred and disbelief and a promise of future venom she could no longer deliver. It spent itself on closed doors. By early afternoon, rain had broken into weak winter sun over wet stone. Holwick's carriage took Victoria to Sydney Place with Mr. Dane, 2 court clerks, and a locksmith carrying new brass keys. The front hall smelled of cold ashes and trapped lavender. Dust filmed the banister where servants had neglected what did not concern comfort. In the drawing room, furniture stood under holland covers like furniture in mourning. Inventory proceeded aloud. Clock from mantel accounted. Silver tea service, partial set, accounted. Walnut escritoire belonging to the late Mrs. Kelly, recovered from upstairs bedchamber and returned to the study. Bundle of unpaid letters tied in blue thread, found in locked sideboard and surrendered for response. One gentleman's watch, pawn ticket folded within ledger pocket, redeemed by order of court from frozen funds and placed in Miss Kelly's hand. The watch was lighter than she remembered and heavier than anything she had carried that week. She pressed her thumb to the scratched case and had to look away for a moment to keep from breaking open where everyone could see. In the attic room, Miss Hart from Holwick House stood by the door with a wrapped parcel. "Your notebook, miss. Fully dry. I changed the wax cloth only." "Thank you." Miss Hart gave a tiny, fierce nod. "No one read it." By 4 o'clock the last clerk had signed out. Constables took post at the corner by magistrate order until trial. Cook, who had served her father for 19 years, emerged from the back passage with red-rimmed eyes and a curtsy that shook. "Miss Victoria," she said, "if you will have me, I should like to stay." Victoria took both of the older woman's hands. "If you will help me answer every letter we should have answered months ago, I should like that very much." Dusk gathered early. Lamps were lit. The house sounded different with honest footsteps in it. Holwick waited in the study doorway while she set her father's watch on the desk and placed the notebook beside it. He had removed his gloves. The bandage at his brow had been changed again, clean white against dark hair. He looked too large for the room, and yet, for the first time, not like an occupying force. "Mr. Dane will remain until accounts are stabilised," he said. "Only if you consent." "I consent." "He will report to you." A pause stretched taut and quiet. Then he said, "I told you I would not beg." She turned fully toward him. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that was almost severe and not severe at all. "I was wrong." The words were plain. No flourish, no shield. He drew a slow breath, as if control had become a heavier labour than surrender. "I ask for 2 things. First, legal partnership in restoring your father's estate until every debt is answered and every wage paid. Second, permission to court you under terms you set, with your refusal accepted at any point." Victoria felt the danger of wanting him, and did not step back from it. "My terms are simple," she said. "No command where a question is owed. No silence where truth is possible, and no saving me from work that is mine." His mouth shifted, that near smile she had seen only in flashes. "Agreed." She walked to the desk, lifted her father's pen and held it out. "Then sign as my partner first, Your Grace. The rest may follow if it earns its place." He took the pen, signed where she indicated, and set the nib down with careful finality. Outside, constables changed watch at the corner. Inside, coal settled in the grate with a low, steady sound. Victoria folded the signed page, placed it in the ledger, and locked the study door from the inside before handing Hallwicke the only key.